a production of South Carolina ETV.
You will relive the events of that fateful night when the Confederate submarine Hunley sank the Yankee warship and the events leading up to the war between the states. Join Project Discovery Revisited for this exciting recreation and learn about how divers discovered the Hunley over 100 years later. See the world's first submarine designed for military purposes today on Project Discovery Revisited.
To find out about the history of the Hunley, Project Discovery talked to Christopher Amer, archaeologist for underwater exploration in South Carolina. Let's listen in.
The war between the states, or what we call quite often the Civil War, or has also been known as that late unpleasantness, was a very innovative time. It was the first time that the innovations of the scientific and industrial revolution had been used on such a large scale in warfare. And it had a wonderful array of innovations that brought on steam propulsion, ironclad for all the armor of the vessels, the torpedo, or what we know now as a mine, but at those days were called a torpedo, and things like rifled shells, which could fire projectiles a tremendous distance with great accuracy. It was an extremely innovative time, and the semi-submersibles and the submersibles were perhaps the most innovative devices. By submersibles, I mean, of course, submarines. And perhaps the most innovative of those and the most famous was the submarine H.L. Hunley. Now, the Hunley was built in the South, and during this industrialized time, the South was extremely lucky in that they had to industrialize. They were forced. You've heard of the expression, necessity is the mother of invention. Well, the South had to industrialize to fight against the might of the North, which was very industrialized. The South was agrarian. They were agricultural in base, and so it was absolutely a monumental feat to get together the know-how and the wherewithal to do this. The Hunley, as you know, was made famous by sinking the USS Housatonic on the night of February 17, 1864, by placing a charge against its hull and detonating it. The Hunley was actually built earlier than that, a year earlier, in Mobile, Alabama. It was the last in a series of 3 submarines that were built by James McClintock and Baxter Watson, who were experimenting in submarine technology in New Orleans. They built the Pioneer, which we believe is on display in New Orleans right now. We're not sure if that is the Pioneer or not. We're working on it. And in 1862, when the North took New Orleans by siege, McClintock and Watson did the prudent thing and left. They moved to Mobile, Alabama, and at that time worked on a second submarine called the American Diver. It sank. The third submarine they worked on was with Horace Hunley, who was their main financial backer, was called the Hunley, H.L. Hunley, named after Horace Hunley himself.
Now, how would you like to have a submarine named after you? The H.L. Hunley was the first submarine to sink a vessel in wartime. Project Discovery discovered what it looked like.
We don't know a lot about it until it was actually found. There were no plans developed at the time. The only plans we have of it were drawn by one Lieutenant William Alexander 40 years after the vessel sank, from memory. And as we now know, his memory was perhaps not as good as it could have been, but the gentleman was in his 80s, so that was okay. The submarine was, as designed, was supposed to be about 35 to 40 feet long. It was made from a boiler, an iron steam boiler that was 4 feet in diameter, cut longitudinally, and a 1-foot strip put into it, and so raised it to a 5 foot in height and 4 feet in diameter. Had all the makings of a modern day submarine. It had ballast tanks to trim it. It had hydroplanes to raise and lower it. It had a propulsion system that was propelled by 8 men turning a crank. It had a snorkel. It had all the features of a modern day submarine. And the feat that it did in sinking a vessel in wartime was not to be repeated until the Second World War, 50 years later, or the First World War, pardon me. So it was quite a feat. In August of 1863, General Beauregard, knowing about the Hunley, had it moved to Charleston to operate against Admiral Dahlgren's blockading fleet that were slowly trying to starve out the city of Charleston. It arrived in great secrecy, rather like a stealth technology, covered with tarpaulin, so people couldn't see what it was, and immediately set to trials out at sea. It immediately got the name of peripatetic coffin. It sank within days of arriving at Fort Johnson, taking 5 of the crew to their death. 3 did escape. It sank about 6 weeks later again on trials, taking, unfortunately, Horace Hunley himself to the bottom and killing him and his crew. Beauregard, not to be daunted by this, said that the vessel can operate as a surface vehicle. It will not dive again. And he put Lieutenant Dixon and Lieutenant William Alexander in charge of the vessel. For several months, they did trials on the vessel. They based it at Battery Marshall at the north end of Sullivan's Island on Breach Inlet. And there's a wonderful description of every evening after dinner, the whole crew would tromp from Fort Moultrie, where they were stationed, along the beach, braving the fire from the blockading fleets offshore, go to Battery Marshall, get into the boat, the submarine, crank offshore 3, 4, 5 miles, and maneuver around, and then crank back in and walk back along the beach to Fort Moultrie in time for breakfast. They had learned they needed to operate at night for their stealth technology to work, and they kept trying to find out which ship to go after. The initial ship that was chosen was called the New Ironsides, and they very quickly learned that if they were going against New Ironsides or any other vessel that was blockaded, is that these vessels anchored in shallow water. Now, the Hunley was designed originally to tow a torpedo, a floating torpedo. The idea was it would dive under the vessel, come up on the other side, and then drag the torpedo, which was towed about 200 feet behind it, against the hull of the vessel and detonate it by little trigger arms. Seeing that the submarine could not go under the vessels because it was so shallow, they had to go to a new system. So they developed a spar in which to carry it on the front, in which it would ram the torpedo against the side of the hull. The torpedo itself was actually built by one of the investors, Mr. Singer. It was called the Singer torpedo, understandably. It could be triggered by either a trigger mechanism or by a tripwire. For the Hunley, they decided to use a tripwire mechanism, whereby with a spike on the front of the torpedo, they would ram it against the side of a hull, it would stick into the hull, then they would slowly back away, unraveling a wire, and then pull the wire and detonate the charge. Finally, everything was right. They had a nice clear night. They had not many waves, not much wind, because at the very best conditions, they could only crank at 4 knots, or about 5 miles an hour.
Boy, the Hunley has quite a history. Project Discovery host Betty Jameson found out more.
Project Discovery turns back the clock to take a look at the Hunley on that historical night of February 17, 1864. Let's take a look at a reenactment scene from the ITV series, The Palmetto Special.
Housatonic. Well, Housatonic, enjoy your last hours of service to the Union Navy.
You intend to make a run for it tonight? But what about the full moon? Sir, surely they will see us.
Not if we're 6 feet below water, they won't.
But our orders are not to submerge. We could be court-martialed.
I don't think so. Not if we accomplish what we set out to do. And I intend to sink the Housatonic. The winds and tides are more favorable for us than they have been in weeks. So tonight's probably as good a chance as we're going to have. We'll leave shortly after dusk. Have the crew assembled.
Lieutenant Dixon and his brave young crew were now prepared for their mission, which, if successful, could alter the course of the war for the South.
The crew is assembled, sir.
Becker? Sir. Ridgway?
Sir.
Miller?
Sir.
Mr. Simpkins? Wicks?
Sir.
Collier?
Sir.
cold out tonight.
Count on me, Captain.
Mr. Carlson.
Give him hell, boy.
Forward. We're far enough out of Breach Inlet now. Prepare to submerge. Open ballast. Rear ballast open. 2 feet. 4 feet. 6 feet. We're at 6 feet below. Close ballast. We should be directly on course for the Housatonic.
Beautiful moon tonight.
Certainly is. Weren't you on first watch just last night, sailor?
Yes, sir. Austin was supposed to pull it, but he became ill after mess.
That's understandable. Isn't night duty boring?
Yes, sir. Well, I generally do a lot of thinking, especially about what I'll do when I go home.
Prepare to surface. Pump ballast. 4 feet. 2 feet. And close ballast. The Housatonic is approximately 1/2 mile dead ahead.
Mr. Carlson, what's the reading on our speed?
Close as I can estimate, sir, we've been averaging right at 3.5 miles per hour. That's fine. We'll go back down and continue on until we're too close for our heavy guns to hit us.
This full moon and cold air reminds me of winter in Vermont. Where are you from?
New Jersey.
I didn't expect South Carolina to be like this.
Me either. Look, there's something causing ripples on the surface.
Could be a school of fish, or porpoises maybe.
Looks like a giant log.
Could be an old palmetto log. I hear they're plentiful around here.
All right, men, our hour has come.
I don't know what it is, but it's heading directly at us.
Full speed ahead and let's ram that torpedo in her stern.
Sound the alarm.
Raise the anchor, start the engine!
All hands to the quarter deck!
That explosion sank the Housatonic in 27 feet of water. All but 5 of our crew, however, survived by climbing the rigging, which remained above the water. All aboard the submarine lost their lives.
A lot has happened since the mid-1990s, when it was verified that the Hunley had been found embedded off the South Carolina coast near Charleston. Christopher Amer, underwater archaeologist, talked with Project Discovery about this exciting discovery.
This is no doubt the most interesting project I've ever worked on. As you know, it was found in May 3rd of 1995 and immediately set up a whole range of questions and arguments. The federal government owns it as a spoil of war after the Civil War. And the state of South Carolina will be the custodians or will look after it in perpetuity, which is a very long time. Yeah. The Hunley is a very significant and very fragile vessel. It is also very unique. There's only one. In archaeology, you only get one chance. In this case, you only have one artifact, the Hunley. So in order to make sure that we did not inadvertently disturb it or destroy any parts of it, we brought in the National Park Service to work with us to bring in an array of remote sensing equipment so that we could look at the vessel from the outside without actually touching it. The Hunley lies in 27 feet of water, buried in the sediments off the harbor. This equipment here is being provided by the National Park Service magnetometer, which, when towed, will take measurements on the magnetic field of the Earth, rather like if you imagine the Earth as a bar magnet. And anything that is in the way of that is metal, for instance, the Hunley, will deflect and give an anomalous reading. This device will tell us what is underneath there, so we can determine what was there, what shape it was, how much metal was there. A second device we used, which will be coming up soon on the tape, was a side scan sonar, which basically takes an acoustic or a sound picture of the bottom. And that helped us to determine the environment around the site and determine if the Hunley was exposed out at the bottom. Then came the good part, where we actually went down and started looking at the vessel. At the bottom there, you see a reflection coming out of one of those glass ports. The reflection is the light reflecting off sand in the interior. The vessel is full of sand, which is good news and bad news. The vessel probably weighs several tons. With the wet sand, it's going to weigh a lot more. It's going to be extremely difficult to bring it up and very costly. But the good news is that it probably filled with sand fairly quickly, which means that there's a good chance of good preservation of organic materials.